don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Heidi Boghosian to discuss her book titled Cyber Citizens: Saving Democracy with Digital Literacy. Our conversation started off talking about the decline of civics education in K-12, its connection to the rise of misinformation and surveillance in the digital age, and the crucial role of digital literacy, cyber hygiene, and critical thinking. We also touched on her critiques of standardized testing, authoritarian trends, and the impact of constant surveillance in educational settings. She emphasized the need for practical skills to identify digital threats and engage with fundamental principles of authority versus liberty. As some of you may know, this area of civics education is something I feel very strongly about, and while we definitely need to build digital literacy and hygiene practices with students, I think it's also a matter of regrowing an understanding of Enlightenment civic and intellectual principles upon which our democracy gingerly rests. In many ways, I view this as an inquiry project as it relates to the questioning of what is true or not and how we find truth. If that's of interest to you, I'd encourage you to take a look at our professional learning in the area of civics and some of the blog pieces where I've written about this and the connections to what I call knowledge-rich inquiry. You can find that on our website, of course, and the address is wegrowteachers.com. You'll also find our project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and AI in education work there, along with other blog posts on instructional practices and mindsets, and of course, this podcast. If you'd like to reach out to me with any questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions, my email address is drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Heidi. I am with Heidi Boghosian, and we're going to talk about her book, Cyber Citizens: Saving Democracy with Digital Literacy. But as I usually like to do, I want to welcome her to the podcast, give her an opportunity to say hello, and provide any relevant details you think people should know about you, and especially in the context of the conversation we're likely to have.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I would say that my background for the last few decades has been working with activists in a legal context. I was director of the National Lawyers Guild for many years, and I worked there during a time when the FBI called animal rights and environmental activists the nation's top domestic terrorism threat. So I've written some legal amicus briefs in cases where the government seems to be overreaching in targeting individuals for, be it protest or online educational activities. And that was in 2005. So now I think that's become relevant once again. But that led me to be interested in surveillance, especially of activists, soon to realize that surveillance is permeating all of our lives, both corporate and government surveillance, of course. And that led me to an interest in how technology is being used to monitor all of us. And now, in the era of social media and mis and disinformation, has made life digitally and in real life more challenging, I think, than ever.
Yeah, for sure. So again, several threads to pull on there. The ones that I think are probably most relevant for the conversations and people that I assume and anticipate might listen to this podcast is about the education piece, and especially K-12. But before we get that, so maybe kind of the elevator pitch, and you did a little bit there, but just a basic question. What's your book about?
My book is about how digital literacy, a term that everyone's familiar with now, especially in education, and civics education are not merely academic skills, but now they are essential tools for preserving democratic participation in this era that is increasingly defined by misinformation, surveillance capitalism, and that we all have a duty to be what I call cyber citizens, that the qualities, before the 60s especially, that we taught in schools, elementary schools, and later, about knowing the rights and responsibilities citizens have in this country, knowing about government so that we can go to the appropriate authorities to let our voices be heard, and to not be merely followers, but to be part of the governmental process. And I think we've seen that lost, and now worsening is the need for that on many levels, to educate young people as well as adults about how to navigate the digital terrain, to be responsible cyber citizens.
Yeah, so the first chapter is titled Flunking Civics 101, and I talk a little bit about it here and mention it in other places. In addition to the work that we do on project-based learning and inquiry and other sort of pedagogy-focused things, is I think a real need for, and you mentioned the 60s, and I think that we have gone decades now without really doing a good job in our K-12 space of teaching what I would call Enlightenment civic and intellectual tradition, or using the word liberal can be a trigger, so sometimes stay away from that. And I certainly think it's important for people to understand how to disagree better, to have some of those norms and things about conversations. But I think, to your point, the understanding of the fundamental principles upon which our democracy rests, or which I would say are Enlightenment liberal principles. I'm curious how you define them. When you talk about civics, what do you mean? And I think it would probably extend beyond just knowing what we mean by rights and responsibilities.
I was shocked to read, in researching this book, and of course the figures change every year, that fewer than 20% of students in this country are proficient in civics. And how I would define civics is a working knowledge of how the government is structured, how citizens fit into the picture of asserting their rights and their responsibilities, quite honestly, which entails a basic knowledge of how the government is structured, the three branches of government, which amazingly many adults cannot name right now. But doing this on a local level, so starting with your local community, understanding who's in charge, where to go if you have a grievance or a complaint, how to approach, be it through letter writings, later op-eds, different varieties, but basically getting the government to serve our best interests. And that necessitates a basic understanding of how the government is formed, how people are elected to positions, and also that we, the people, it sounds cliched, but we have the power, when knowledgeable and informed, to really help make changes in policies that we think are unjust, or that, for example, favor corporate interests, which of course we see increasingly. That government leaders should not be serving their own self-interests before that of the people of the country. And I understand, I'm not an educator, but I understand there's something called action civics, where schools try to incorporate more practical examples and get kids to participate in things in their neighborhoods or communities, which I think sounds fabulous. I also think that without a grounding in civics, we've come to be really in a state of emergency as with the introduction of the iPhone and social media around 2007, our lives have changed dramatically in how we interact with others. Local newspapers are falling by the wayside. We have no investigative journalism pretty much. So I see it as learning how to be a full participant in how we engage with government entities, but also other, nonprofit organizations, advocacy organizations that may have our best interests at heart, as we increasingly become, thanks to certain Supreme Court decisions, beholden to corporate interests. The demise of mom and pop shops, I see it in my neighborhood with chains, retail chains coming in. We've lost in many neighborhoods the ability to interact directly with our fellow citizens. And I think that is actually a byproduct of the digital age and certain corporate and government interests who do not want us meeting up and organizing and finding the power that we all have within ourselves, multiplied by people that we live and work with.
So there's two things there that I'm wondering about. One, and I talk a lot about, again, this Enlightenment liberalism, which I think it extends just sort of theoretically in terms of principles. So I'm curious, do you see Enlightenment liberalism as a sort of root of the advocacy that you're doing, or if not, then are there different things that you would root them in? And the other question, which I think is somewhat related, because in my estimation, we've sort of lost the plot, lost the thread on teaching the dynamics there and how those principles work, and we're seeing some effects of that. So when you mentioned the 60s, why or how have we departed from what the sort of path and learning that you would, I would assume, would advocate for as being important to get us back on that path, or something closer to where you would be comfortable with?
Well, I think we're on the same page. I'm sure your listeners are aware that what changed in the 60s was an emphasis in teaching really rote memory and preparation for standardized testing. And that became a big focus over the next several years. What I think is problematic with that to begin with is a deference to standardized thinking without the sort of critical evaluation and analysis that I thought schools were teaching, into, answering multiple choice questions. And with that, I've also observed, and the New York Times did a great study on this a couple of years ago, the reintroduction of junior ROTC classes taught often by military personnel or retired personnel in schools that emphasize a deference to authority and hierarchy, and what you might call a break from creative thinking, individual thought, which I think has really ushered in a complacency and lack of awareness about how easily pliable young people are, adults are, when subjected to, even things like omnipresent surveillance, which tends to make people suppress a lot of their original thinking and expression. So we tend to want to conform. I think that with the emphasis on standardized testing, there became less room in classrooms for innovation, individualism, all of the qualities that, if you're in a JROTC class, are not really welcomed. And I think that now being that we are in an emergency, and something happened to me recently that I'll mention later that made me realize how susceptible we all are to online scams, for example. It's not just that we need to have a renewed effort in cyber citizenship, civics. We actually need to teach practical skills about recognizing scams. And when it happens to you, for me, it changed something. I've thought about this issue for a long time, but I never really fell for a scam until a few weeks ago. And now that's all I can think of, because every email that I get, I have to double check. I do not trust things, even with a video face to face, because AI has become so sophisticated so quickly that we're all really vulnerable. But I think what we have to do is reach kids as soon as they're able to type on a laptop or a device, and start giving them the hard lessons, gamify things, make it a family project. But I think classroom education with family reinforcement is how we're going to get through this next period.
One of the things one of the words that comes to mind when I listen to you talk there, about scams or authenticity of videos or whatever it might be, and it is really amazing. I was mentioning yesterday to a friend, I guess the video, I don't know, I guess it's a platform or tool called Sora, and they're creating videos that they don't look like AI. And, I see these things of like a man sleeping on a porch and a bear comes up and licks his nose, and you think, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And then, oh, well, that's AI. And I've seen, ads for AI. I don't know, I guess you say women. I don't, they're not real, but women, they're, conversation partners or something much more assorted. And it's really, an interesting dynamic. But the word that comes to mind is skepticism. And again, I think this is, to me, one of the fundamental pieces. I'm an inquiry teaching advocate, and I do think it's important that we use some traditional methods and that we're building knowledge. I think sort of the idea of a culture having a set of shared knowledge makes some sense to me. And I think that's probably a little bit more, if you want to code it, might be right coded, red coded, or whatever you want to say. But I think that makes some sense. And there's, windows of variability outside the sort of core. But the idea that and I traced it back to 1983, A Nation at Risk, that was released, and that, I think, set in motion a school accountability sort of approach that incentivized answers and some of the things that you mentioned, standardized tests that are, the measures for those kinds of things. And it didn't make it impossible to use inquiry in classrooms, but it probably disincentivized it. And seems to me, I don't have any evidence or data to back this up, but intuitively seems true that we have had decades now of classrooms that maybe disincentivize the kinds of teaching where you might be forced to, and maybe even it was incentivized to have different opinions and to question whether or not this was true or this assertion was true, whether it's in history or whatever it might be. And so we've got decades of sort of the I guess application in some ways of classic liberalism that hasn't been it hasn't been done in classrooms. And now it feels like we, as a result of that and many other factors, we've got people who are not, that we don't have that first instinct to say, is that true? How is that true? How might that be true? When might that be true? Would it depend on if it was from this person, or what are the things that might make it true? And understanding the difference between what we value or have determined as knowledge, which is of course always conditional, but we have accepted knowledge and things that we believe are true, and then what we might value as perspectives. This sort of idea that we have, everybody has their own truth, that lived experience says this is true and that's true, when in fact I would value I would label those more as perspectives. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Um, you just reminded me of an organization I mentioned in the book called Project Yano out of San Diego, which is one of the top ports where military recruiting takes place.
Hmm.
And for years, they have been providing educational tabling and events that share with young people alternatives to joining the military. And they recently did a textbook study of some of the books that are used in junior ROTC classes. And they analyzed, several teachers were on the committee that analyzed these books and found that, perhaps not surprisingly, they had sort of racist and other stereotypes. So narrowing down to sort of one acceptable viewpoint, lessening any discussion about the impact of US invasions in other countries. No discussion of slavery, the things that we're also seeing a resurgence of. But I think that when you eliminate different viewpoints or the different experiences of communities all around the nation, that we, again, reinforce a certain narrative. And we're seeing this play out under recent presidential administrations with, as you know, banned books, removing words from our lexicon that are deemed anti-American, all of that. And I, as someone working in this field of education, I'm sure you see how diversity in classrooms has only been a wonderful way of opening up everyone's minds to putting themselves in the shoes of other people, feeling other experiences. I think we're seeing sort of a funneling of some antiquated notions that, for example, the civil rights movement worked for decades to get rid of, obviously coming back, a regression on how women are treated. People who look like they're from another country being swept up by ICE. So I think in the classroom, in addition to the extent possible, in various education boards, what a great challenge our educators have right now, who believe in this enlightened liberalism, but are maybe restrained from teaching it, or even the librarians in schools who might be attacked for not getting rid of certain titles. I think it calls for creative alternatives around those. I remember after 9/11, when government officials went into libraries seeking the reading lists, certain librarians came up with a creative signage that said, it was a code that they said something like "no visitors today" or something. But we need to think of ways to get around regressive policies and do our best to try to keep alive the open-mindedness that schools should be teaching, and exposure to other cultures and communities that so enrich everyone's lives.
Yeah, one of the authors and thinkers that I really value in this space is Jonathan Rauch. I don't know how familiar you are with his work. You're nodding your head yes. Kindly Inquisitors in 1993, really great book. And if you read it now, it feels like it was written very much more recently. Then Constitution of Knowledge, which I think is 2020, maybe 21. And what he talks about are the rules and commitments of liberal science, and I've written about it and talk about it sometimes. the rules being the fallibilist rule. No one gets the final say. So we're always continuing to check whether things are true or not true. That's why it's conditional. You don't get to say this is knowledge and will always be true going forward. Then the empirical rule, which is no one has personal authority, so you can claim a statement is knowledge insofar as we can still check it, and it doesn't matter the identity of the checker, regardless of the source of the statement. And when we work with schools on what I call objective pluralism in these Enlightenment liberal traditions, what I see, I'm curious if you agree with this, that there's a liberal authoritarianism that we see on both left and right, and that in the education space. So I would say, especially in the last 10, 15 years, that the right has certainly had more governmental power, obviously has much more governmental power right now, less so in education and culture, whereas the left tends to have much more sway and control in the education and culture aspects. And higher education, obviously is much more left-leaning in terms of professors and things like that. As is, I think, K-12 education, although there's some research by the Heritage Foundation that says, they may be left-leaning, but they don't tend to be terribly activists, and that's another thread we can pull on. But, some of the things that you're mentioning with the current administration, regressive policies, liberal authoritarian policies, which I agree with, I think we had seen some versions of that from the left about, because of the dint of somebody's color of skin, that they had special knowledge and that they were to be arbiters that you couldn't question it, right? Questioning somebody who had dark skin on what they're saying was true or not true was seen as racist. And, there's lists of things like that. So, I'm curious how you think about that sort of, whether they're equivalent or symmetrical. I don't think they are, but that doesn't mean to me that they're not, that authoritarian, a liberal authoritarianism isn't a problem from both left and right.
Oh, I think it definitely is a problem from both left and right. I think there's a slight difference, though, in how we've gotten to this kind of stalemate in government. You have to look back several decades to the forming of the Federalist Society, which, different from Democrat types, agreed to disagree within a big tent that had a long-term agenda, basically of installing conservatives on the Supreme Court, throughout the judiciary at all levels around the country, and who've done a pretty good job of that. But they were thinking long-term, and they didn't quibble over what you would call minor differences.
Popular front kind of mentality.
Exactly. I think definitely the left is guilty of many things, one of which I think is they haven't figured out how to message, if we're talking social media and other electronic forms of communication. They haven't really done a good job of highlighting certain successes politically. And I hate to say this, but the right is a master at memes, which we also see among many extremist hate groups too, online, disguised, in codes or humor, but that work on susceptible individuals who want to be part of something. They've done a really good job of coming up with their symbols and ways to do that. And the left has not. Now, I wish we weren't at a point where social media so dominates what many people, where they get their news, where they learn to imitate others, engaging in hateful or unproductive speech. I wish we weren't there, but it's here. And I think that the left has kind of offered up by really focusing on certain issues that give the Republicans and others fertile territory to make fun. And we all know that. And humor works so beautifully in all of these things. So I do think both political parties and people of different persuasions are certainly extremist in many ways. And I think that this polarization and extremism in all forms of media and how we, I have friends that won't be friends with someone who voted for a certain candidate, for example.
Right.
I can't be that way. And I think when I hear of efforts being made for bipartisan collaboration, I'm thrilled because that's what we need. And I think same in the classrooms, we shouldn't have any particular ideology, but now especially we need to be teaching kids. A think tank, and I can't remember their name, came up with the term truth decay. And I think we're right in the middle of that. We don't know what's real and what's not real.
Right.
And no wonder we're bombarded with so much information to begin with. I mean, I was shocked to hear that so many schools let kids bring cell phones into the classroom. I would not. And I also think, the children of Steve Jobs and Zuckerman don't let their kids often use social media till they reach a certain age, or which is telling about the sway of corporations, big tech, into our lives. And I also want to go back to what you said at the beginning, that Democrats or liberals tend to have, the expertise in education. Well, look at what's happening with Google Classroom and all the other corporate teaching aids that so many schools now rely on. I think that's a huge problem. And the software that monitors remote test taking, for example, and you have to show a video of your room, before and after the test. I think that should not be in the classrooms.
Yeah, I haven't heard it in a while, but it was on offer at one point when, especially I think it was Moms for Liberty was really, really active. They seem to have kind of died down. But COVID pushing school online, certainly opened up some parents' eyes of like what's happening in the classrooms. What are they talking about? What are they teaching? How well are they teaching? All of those kinds of things. And one of the things that I'd heard as an offer or an idea offered was that we would basically put cameras in classrooms. And I thought, what a terrible idea that seems to be. And it gets me to one of the things that you mentioned earlier, the idea of surveillance. And I'm going to guess, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're not a fan of like Life 360 and things like that. I find that to be such a strange dynamic that, and I have two daughters who are 16 and 18. People seem to be just fine with being constantly under surveillance. And I find that to be technically, I think the term is bonkers, to want to be able to say that actually is a good thing. And there are some good things that might come as a result of Life 360. And don't get me wrong, but I think the net result is not good. So having that pushed into classrooms where we have cameras just seems absolutely bonkers.
Well, it's totalitarianism. I think that we have been primed to accept surveillance, especially after the events of 9/11, because the government's mantra was basically surveillance will make us safer. And people, of course, want to be safe if they think they're fighting an enemy, terrorism.
Yeah, and in some ways it may have.
Yes, that's true. Look, we know of high-profile examples, the Boston Marathon brothers that were found in Watertown, Mass., due to piecing together street surveillance and other things. But in places where you have an expectation of privacy, and I would say in a classroom where you need to be free to make mistakes and to, speak freely, hopefully, that's going to change with the surveillance. And I think we already know that because there have been studies done where pupils who know they're being monitored through some of these software programs that were marketed, mind you, after school mass shootings as a way to keep your children safe at school.
Mm-hmm.
They know that their emails are being read by administrators or someone, and they don't speak the way they normally would. They make sure they know what the possible trigger words are, suicide, killing, stuff like that, and they avoid them. And it's also, there were studies in the UK and here, of course, where you go to a free, a coffee place where maybe it's in the employee lounge, and the sign says, the one sign has flowers and it says, "Give what you will," with a little change thing. They tested it with another sign that has two eyes looking directly at you. "Give what you will." And of course, the one with the eyes, even though we know it's just a piece of paper with art on it, people gave more because they felt they were being watched. We definitely tailor our behavior. I think that, we have to trust kids. If you don't trust your child, or school systems market these as keeping them safer, really what it's doing is stilting their many options to learn in a judgment-free, encouraging space. So I think all of these surveillance, most of them are horrible. Do we need some public surveillance cameras? Sure. If corporations want to put those up to prevent theft, but not in every aspect of our life.
Yeah, the freedom of expression obviously being a hallmark of Enlightenment liberalism, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and like I'm hearing stories now, I guess it's in England, where people are being arrested for social media posts that are, offensive, so on and so forth. And it's not that we want to encourage offensive speech, but of course, being arrested for saying something about trans people that you might find offensive, that's not something that we want here. And to your point, I think that like I travel internationally sometimes to work with schools, and I was traveling internationally this summer, and I didn't think it was likely, but just the fact that I had to entertain it as a possibility, as a concern, is a sign of a deterioration of the sort of freedom of expression and liberty that I tend to, and on some social media, be very critical of the Trump administration. And so would I be subject to, some sort of, questioning, detainment, or perhaps worse upon reentry into the country? Again, I think it's very unlikely. I don't doubt that. I'm sure that there are some surveillance going on, and I think that's a bad thing, but I'm probably not on anybody's big radar, right? But again, just the fact that I might think that, based on what other things we've seen, is evidence, I would say, of corrosion of that freedom of expression in even just the smallest ways, but in incremental loss of those rights, I think, is something we should really, really pay attention to. One of the things you write about is digital literacy and failing digital literacy, and you've got some conspiracy theory, disinformation kinds of I guess terms and ways in which it's used. How do you define, I guess, digital literacy, healthy digital literacy? What do you think we should be aiming at, sort of fundamentally, and main sort of principles that schools should think about in terms of digital literacy, especially in terms of what we've been talking about?
Digital literacy means having the knowledge and the critical thinking skills to navigate, evaluate, and importantly, to safely participate in digital spaces. It's more than knowing how to use your devices and apps. It's about understanding power dynamics, risks, recognizing misinformation, knowing who's collecting your data and how to opt out, and basically making informed decisions about your digital footprint. I want to tell briefly my con that I fell for. Because I think with AI, digital literacy has to teach this. I got an email a few weeks ago from a person with an Armenian name. I'm half Armenian, saying that he was a law student at Yale Law School and was interested in some part-time work, which I assumed he might have known I needed, or I do research and I could use research help, which was true.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, how did you get my email? And he said, the Armenian Bar Association, which I then went online and saw that, yes, I'm listed as a member with my email address. But he said, and this was the first warning sign, he was in a bit of a hurry to let the school know if he, which as I look back, why would the school even care? But we arranged for a Zoom that day. And I like to do things last minute, so it was fine. I told him on the Zoom a little bit what I needed, some Freedom of Information Act requests, that I could pay up to 5 or 10 hours a week. Now, I'm looking on the Zoom at a young man, breathing, living, answering my questions, although some were a little over the top. He said I said, what do you want to do after law school? I want to be the mayor of San Francisco. I should have stopped there. But I didn't. And I said I'd get back to him with a list of what I needed done. And I said, but tomorrow I'll send you a list. As soon as I did that, we hung up. He started, I have a signature line with my email address on the bottom. He started texting and emailing me. He had told me on the phone his parents had died a few years ago. Another warning sign, a crisis. So he started pinging me, I need money, I need it now. And then I'm like, okay, this is a scam. So I had checked his LinkedIn account, as I always do. He was there, but it just said Yale Law School. I thought that was suspicious, but so I wrote to him, I'm like, I'm sorry, changed my mind. The emails are still coming to me, but I'd never had a visual AI spam, a clone. So what I'm imagining is they might have written to a bunch of Armenians, because when you hear from a fellow Armenian, it's like a kindred spirit. Ever since that experience, I'm on a mission to tell people about deepfakes and clones, because I've now experienced it. And even though I knew something was off, I went ahead. At least I didn't pay. But I think that, so much in teaching is theory. And I think that we're in a different world now. There has to also be some hard lessons taught about things like this, because I've been thinking about this topic for years and I fell for it. I mean, most of the time I recognize scams, but when they pick on something personal and make use of that, you just have to be doubly careful. And kids too.
So you think that the person, or the quote unquote person who was on the other end of the video, was an AI generated quote unquote person? I don't even know. There's got to be a term we've got to come up with.
Well, AI systems now can fabricate voices, gestures, not just taking a picture, say, of Nancy Pelosi and doctoring that.
Mm-hmm.
It can just make up a person. And the speech and the look is so convincing that anything can be made to seem real and to say or do anything. I had warning signs, but most of the time, I think when we look at someone on screen, we think they're real.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me a little bit on Facebook. I was receiving for maybe a couple weeks, and maybe this is revealing. I don't think it's revealing of my browsing history, but maybe it is. There were two different, and again, I say in air quotes as I'm making it, like, women. These AI women who were, there was a couple of versions. One was, a little bit more anodyne and, we can talk about anything you want and that kind of thing. And then another that was very sexual in nature. And I just thought, wow, it's scary and really bizarre. There's so many questions that raises. And so I suppose one of the questions that I have in terms of teaching, we've talked a bit about knowledge. You've mentioned critical thinking a few times, and I think it is a matter of both having some knowledge and understanding of some of the things that are at play, some of the tools that might be used, some of the rhetorical devices that they might use, some of the things that they might, as you mentioned, sort of something personal. You're Armenian, and that's a way in. I got an email spoof from a former school that we had done some work with that looked very, very real, and I clicked on it as well and thought, oh, I shouldn't have clicked on that. And now I'm waiting for my computer to blow up and or my bank account to be drained or something like that, right? But it strikes me as, again, knowledge about this stuff is not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. So how do we embed the, again, sense of skepticism and critical thinking in people so that they are asking whether this is real regularly, but then also having the tools to be able to sort of figure that out, because that's important as well. And I don't know if you have any prescriptions. I know you're not an educator, so have you seen some things that you think have been effective? Have you heard about teachers doing some things? It seems to me is just really getting into examples like this and saying, all right, whether it's about surveillance or whether it's about deep fakes or whatever it might be, is examining it and really doing some critical thinking about and with those kinds of things.
I've watched a few online classroom videos that teach kids how to double check, how to look at a website, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think this was in the context of hate-related entities. And the instructor was asking questions, the kids were participating, they were looking at all the elements on the website. I think what we need are tech labs. So much as in science classes, there's a laboratory component. Look, kids love tech. What fun to have a tech lab and to sort of frame it as, can you find the con? And then having examples, say a deepfake video that resonates with the kids for some reason. Then you unpack it. You ask the kids, what could be fake about this? And you discuss it and you show other examples of that. I think first it would be fun, which is important. It would be current because it could use real examples. There are so many cons happening every day. All you have to do is look it up online and you'll see great examples. Sad examples, elders giving away all of their savings, dating apps that come up with people who too quickly say they love you without even having met you. But I think that that could be rigorous, it could be exciting, and it was not going to cost schools a fortune at all. You just have a few tech people run the department. It would be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that would be a part of it. I also, again, as a former social studies teacher and somebody who really thinks civics is has not been done particularly well over a number of years, it strikes me that giving, I mean, debates or thought experiments and that kind of work, which is again not always rooted in academic content area knowledge. It could be, uh, but where when I think people tend to right now be really focused on whether left or right is better or worse, or that's the polarization thing, and instead they should be paying more attention to authority versus liberty and giving examples of Life 360 or school surveillance, or I'm sure you could give more examples than I, but they're not hard they wouldn't be hard to come up with, and really then using that to examine, how much authority are you willing to subject to? 9/11 is a great example. We were very emotionally responsive, and understandably so, to say, yeah, I'll give up some of my freedom and some of my liberty in order to not have terrorists blowing up our cities. And that's certainly understandable, but it's a reasonable, that those kinds of examples, uh, large scale, small scale examples, and having students wrestle with those paradoxes and those subtleties, I think, are how we help them understand some of those fundamental, again, enlightenment, intellectual, and civic principles.
Well, I don't know if schools require any kind of volunteerism, say on a high school level, but I love the idea of a school class working with a local nonprofit group or two. And that could even be ones with different ethos.
Mm.
So it could be more conservative and one more liberal. And then having them come back after maybe they volunteer an hour or two and in the classroom discuss, the pros and cons of each.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that real life experience is going to leave a meaningful mark on young minds, especially if it's couched in an educational setting where you can really analyze it with the instructor after and keep referring back to what they learned from these examples.
Yeah, having to identify some of the things one would need to know in order to answer a question is one of the things that we do a lot of work with and emphasize in schools. So, instead of saying, let's look at whether you like President Trump or dislike President Trump or something like that that might get at some of the polarization, but to examine a question like, does the executive branch have more power than it should right now? And over the last several presidents. And I think there's a more than colorable argument to say yes. But to understand that, one would need to know, what do we mean by checks and balances? What are the roles and responsibilities of the three branches, and how are those things being played out? And again, you start to get into some of the authority and liberty kinds of arguments and other pieces that one would need to really think about in order to do that. And I'm hesitant with AI to indulge in those tools as much as some others. The use of Perplexity and Comet as a browser to have it do tasks for me seems like a good idea, but I have such a sense of like there's something here that I'm giving up or potentially giving up that I think is not a net good. So yeah, I don't know, not really a question there, although I am curious. I saw you shaking your head when I was talking about AI and AI tools. Um,
We
any
need,
recommendations there?
yeah, obviously we need to balance this newcomer into our lives. Um, I will confess, I love aspects about ChatGPT, for example,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because I've asked it, and I think it depends how you form your query is one thing.
Sure.
I've
Which is
done,
an inquiry project.
yeah, I've done a lot when I was in law school and after. You get used to forming queries on LexisNexis, whatever. And I like to form really specific queries just to see what it comes up with. And it's given me ideas or sources occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
But I really think, again, as a non-educator, that my father used to say to me, because he was an artist, before Picasso became famous, he learned sort of traditional drawing and painting, and then he could reduce it to a few lines. I think we need to teach the basics of thinking, uh, inquiry, all the things you've mentioned, uh, without AI in the classroom, and then teach people how to use AI and obviously highlight the dangers, but the positives. So my feeling is if you've written an essay and you want to run it through Pro Writing Aid or ChatGPT and say, like, reduce the redundancies in this or point them out to me is better.
Yeah.
It can supplement teaching, but I think first they have to demonstrate a savvy of all the things we've been talking about, civics, basic. They need to know how to write and to think,
Yeah.
and then to criticize and analyze.
Yeah. Yeah. If AI is doing the thinking, that means you're not doing the thinking, and that's a real problem. So I'm mindful of time, and I think maybe one last question that I have is maybe if a school leader is listening, what are the things that school leaders should really be thinking about in terms of AI and cyber citizenship? I would imagine both in terms of tools that students might be using and the effects on them, but also security. I remember when Google Classroom started to become a big thing, and there was some valid concerns about student privacy and data and those kinds of things. But what are the things they should be considering, questions they should be asking?
I would emphasize, in addition to those, the need to focus on cyber hygiene. Those are the everyday habits concerning digital safety, reducing your vulnerability to cyber threats. We all know, at least we've heard, using strong, unique passwords. Don't use them over several devices. Use multi-factor authentication. Do not click on a link unless you know the person sending it. Regularly back up your data, and adjust your privacy settings on social media and email to limit data tracking. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has a wonderful thing called Privacy Badger that I just put on mine. It looks, when you search websites, it alerts you of the trackers. So avail yourself of the many free educational and, helpful protective devices. Always have, a scanner on your software. And that should be taught very early. It should almost be like the alphabet that we learn. If you're going to own devices and use them, be on social media, you have to know how to be safe. Safety first. It's, the government tells us they need to spy on us for our own safety, but that's not true. And we don't emphasize enough the practical tips that we can all start doing, even if you start on a small level. Use a phrase for your password, use multi-factor authentication, basic things, and then add them as your comfort level grows.
Well, the book is Cyber Citizens, Saving Democracy with Digital Literacy. I imagine there's some links you would want to share and places you want folks to visit.
Well, my website is my name, Heidi Boghosian, BOGHOSIAN .com. And I have links to a couple of other books I've written on privacy and surveillance and tips for digital go bag, things like that.
Okay. Social media or anything like that?
I'm trying to get off social media, but I am on Blue Sky. Haven't posted much, but I'm trying to get off the big ones.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, we will put at least the link to your website in the show notes and probably maybe the Blue Sky. But it's been a pleasure. Certainly a prescient conversation, and unfortunately probably will become even more so. So appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.